Everyone loves a good story, particularly if that story incorporates a conspiracy subplot. Dan Brown, the author of the international bestseller, The Da Vinci Code, has written a spell-binding novel which places the Catholic Church at the very center of a most intriguing conspiracy to cover up the real truth about Jesus Christ. A truth which, according to the Da Vinci Code novel, has been preserved and kept by a secret organization known as the Priory of Zion. A secret organization which is determined that at some point it will bring forth for public examination the historical documentation of the truth about Jesus Christ, knowing full well that when they expose the truth, it will likely destroy the Catholic Church, its influence, and the Christian faith which it propagates. That is a novel that is having a significant impact on our generation. I had an attorney, a well-educated individual, who called me up and was expressing severe frustration and anxiety after having read the Da Vinci Code because of the preponderance of attacks that it makes upon the church and upon Christian faith. The book has had a significant impact, not because it places the Catholic Church at the center of a conspiracy. Many authors have done that. The book is significant not because it attacks Christian faith. Numerous books have done that. But the reason the book is having a significant impact on an entire generation is because it, in a compelling way, presents information as fact. And that there are many people who do not have the research skills, they do not have the knowledge of history or of church history whereby they can understand exactly the truth about these so-called facts being presented in the Da Vinci Code. I told the attorney, I said, if you understood church history and the science of textual criticism, you would know that all of his assertions about the New Testament are absolutely false. You and I don't have to be threatened by the Da Vinci Code because it is filled not with facts, but with factoids. A factoid, by definition, is inaccurate information that is being presented as fact, and that because of its constant repetition takes on the impact and weight of truth. But it's a factoid, not a fact. The facts of the Da Vinci Code are little more than factoids, but most people don't understand this, so they are accepting these alleged facts as truth. Now, to make this even worse, he was interviewed by Matt Lauer on October the 10th, 2005 on the Today Show. And Matt Lauer asked this question. He said, how much of this book is based on reality in terms of things that actually happened? To which Dan Brown responded, absolutely all of it is historical fact. USA Today newspaper on November the 3rd, 2003, in reviewing the Da Vinci Code novel, said, it is historic fact with a contemporary storyline. I believe the book has had a significant impact on the way many people perceive the church and Christianity because of an uncritical eye and a lack of understanding of church and secular history. And because they believe what they read and believe what they see, they're going to just accept all of the factoid foundation of the Da Vinci Code as though it were reality. That is why the church cannot remain silent in the face of this novel. But I'm going to do something this morning. I'm going to give you an overview of the book, an overview of 11 of the most critical factoids upon which he builds his novel. He says they're true, they're not. And I'm going to focus in on 4, if we have time this morning, And if you can demonstrate that these 4 factoids are really factoids and not truth, then it calls into question every other factual assertion of the book. If you cannot trust Dan Brown on the most critical facts of his novel, then you have reason to question every other factual assertion that the man makes. Let me give you the overview from the official website on the Internet. The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Famed symbologist Professor Robert Langdon is called to the Louvre Museum one night where a curator has been murdered, leaving behind a mysterious trail of symbols and clues. With his own survival at stake, Langdon, aided by the police cryptologist, unveils a series of stunning secrets hidden in the works of Leonardo da Vinci, all leading to a covert society dedicated to guarding an ancient secret that has remained hidden for 2,000 years. The pair set off on a thrilling quest through Paris, London, and Scotland, collecting clues as they desperately attempt to crack the code and reveal secrets that will shake the very foundations of mankind. The key character in this novel is a fountain of historical information by the name of Sir Lee Teabing. In his mouth, Dan Brown has all kinds of interesting factoids coming forth that Dan weaves into his novel. Let me just tell you this. If you were to research these factoids, you would come to the conclusion that Sir Lee Teabing, who is considered a very knowledgeable historian and researcher, who is intelligent, rich, and endearingly quirky, is in fact so historically challenged, no principal would allow this alleged historian to teach on his or her faculty. And they would not let him touch the subject of history. And yet, millions of people the world around are accepting this novel as historic reality. Let me share with you what I consider to be the 11 most fundamental factoids upon which this novel is built. Now, you're asking yourself, have you read the novel? Yes, I have read the novel. I read the novel right after it came out. 11 factoids upon which this whole thing stands or falls. Number 1, the Priory of Zion is a secretive group who possesses the real truth about Jesus. Factoid number 2, Jesus was known by His followers to be only a human, not divine. Number 3, Jesus wanted Mary Magdalene to be the head of His church. Not Peter, but Mary Magdalene. Factoid number 4, Jesus sired a child by Mary Magdalene, and he now has many descendants. Moving on to the 5th factoid upon which the Da Vinci Code is based is this. It asserts that Constantine commissioned a complete rewriting of the New Testament that you and I have in our hands, and he did so in the 4th century. The 6th factoid is that the revised New Testament portrays Jesus for the first time as being divine. The 7th factoid is that it is the revised New Testament, revised by Constantine, that designates Peter, not Mary Magdalene, as the head of the church. The 8th factoid is that the Priory of Zion will reveal the truth that will destroy the church. The 9th factoid is this. The Pope cannot allow the real truth to come out. Why? Because it would destroy his church. The 10th factoid is that the Pope has commissioned a group, the Opus Dei, to destroy the evidence and all living members of the Priory of Zion. I mean, every good conspiracy's got to have a villain, right? And then the 11th factoid upon which the novel is based is that the Priory of Zion will reveal both the truth and the identity as to Jesus' true descendants who are living on the earth today. Now, you see that as being absolutely incredible. But there are people in this world who will see every one of these factoids as being historical reality. let's address just 4 of the critical issues, and we'll try to address those briefly this morning. The first issue is this. The Da Vinci Code asserts that the Priory of Zion is a super-secretive society that exists today. It started, according to the Da Vinci Code, back during the Crusades, and it has existed down through the centuries unto this very day. Is that historical reality? Well, let's just see. According to the Da Vinci Code, Godefroy de Bouillon founded a secret brotherhood and charged them with protecting the secret. And this is what Sir Lee Teabing is asserting is the beginning of the Priory of Zion. But what does history tell us? History tells us that the Priory did exist during the Crusades, but it ceased to exist in 1617. According to Richard Abbadis, in his work, The Truth Behind the Da Vinci Code, King Godefroy did start an organization after conquering Jerusalem, part of the Crusades. It was a group of monks known as the Order of Our Lady of Zion. That was what King Godefroy de Bouillon created, a group of monks, a group called the Order of Our Lady. That is not the same as the Order or Priory of Zion. So even the group that Sir Lee Teabing says was the beginning of this super-secretive organization, the Priory of Zion, is in fact not even the same thing. Didn't even have the same name. And it ceased to exist after 1617. It did not have an existence that came down through the centuries to this very day. So already this whole idea of the Priory of Zion, the Order of Zion, is deeply, deeply suspect. Where do we first hear of the Priory of Zion in modern history? It happens to be 1956, according to historical research. A Frenchman by the name of Pierre Plantard resurrected the Priory as a group in 1956. According to Paul Smith in his work, The Priory of Zion Debunked, he said the actual name, the Priory of Zion, is not mentioned anywhere until 1956 when Pierre Plantard started a social club devoted to the cause of low-cost housing. I mean, it may have been a noble cause, but that has nothing to do with debunking the Catholic Church and the Christian faith. Plantard, however, did create another priory or order. According to Paul Smith, Priory Documents and Articles linked with Pierre Plantard, he makes this statement. He said, after the Priory ended, that's the first Priory in 1956, Plantard started another one in the early 1960s. The intent of this Priory was to bring back the French monarchy. They tried to build off the rumor that there was a hidden royal bloodline in France by planting forged papers in libraries around Europe. Isn't that interesting? His house was searched, and Priory documents that said that Plantard himself was the true king of France were found. Plantard was charged with being a harmless crank, and he was issued a severe warning for playing games. And yet he is the one who in our times started the modern Priory of Zion. And yet Dan Brown has Sir Lee Teabing saying the Priory of Zion goes way back to the times of the Crusades. And that it was created as a custodian of critical secrets about Jesus and the truth of Christian faith. Historical investigation demonstrates that the most fundamental fact about the existence of the Priory of Zion debunks the most fundamental factoid of the Da Vinci Code. And if this fact, the very existence of the Priory of Zion, is called into serious question, then you've got to question every other factoid that Dan Brown asserts is historical reality. There is no Priory of Zion in existence today that is the custodian of a treasure trove of hidden secrets that would debunk the truth about Jesus and destroy the church. All right, the second factoid, that Constantine commissioned the rewriting of the New Testament. According to the Da Vinci Code, and I quote, Constantine commissioned and financed the new Bible, which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits. Earlier Gospels were outlawed and burned. Constantine, according to Dan Brown, was needing to consolidate his political power in the Roman Empire. And in order to do that, he wanted to unify various sectors of the church throughout the Roman Empire. So in order to consolidate his political power through religious channels, he brought together 300 of the leaders of the church throughout the Roman Empire. And according to Brown, they rewrote the New Testament under Constantine's commission and guidance. And in that New Testament, they for the first time present Jesus as being God, because if Constantine was going to consolidate his political power, he needed the authority of a God figure upon which to coalesce Christendom under his political leadership. That's what Dan Brown's asserting. And that the New Testament you and I hold in our hands is really not the original New Testament, but it is a fictitious document or book that was designed to serve political purposes. He reigned from 306 to 337. Now those dates, 306 to 337, lock those dates into your mind because they are critical to debunking the factoid of Constantine's having rewritten the entire New Testament. Let's go back in church history a couple of hundred years. By A.D. 100, all 27 books of our New Testament had been written and were circulating by copies throughout Christendom. When John finished writing the Revelation, that closed the 27 books that we all now know as the New Testament. So by the early 90s, all 27 books that we have in our Bible had been written, and copies were being made by the hundreds and the hundreds and the hundreds, and they were circulating among Christendom. We know this because we know church history. People got copies of John's Gospel, they wanted copies. They got copies of Paul's letters, they wanted copies. They treasured these as being of divine authority. These were their sacred scriptures. They didn't have a canon of Scripture that they would call the New Testament, but this was their Bible. So there were thousands of copies of these letters and gospel accounts that would be made over the centuries, but by the year 100, 200 years before Constantine, these letters that we call the New Testament was circulating around Christendom. By the year 200, all four of the Gospels had been recognized as being authentic throughout Christendom. Now let me quote Irenaeus in the 2nd century church. He lived from 130 to 202 A.D. Notice what he says, because in this quote, in a treatise he did entitled Against Heresies, he mentions Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He says, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what has been preached by Peter. Luke, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. So what you have here is, during the 2nd century A.D., we have the four Gospels, which the Da Vinci Code claims were written under Constantine's leadership at the Council of Nicaea in 325. We already have them By the year 200, they are well-circulated, well-known gospel accounts, and they are recognized as being of divine authority. How can Constantine write something that existed more than 100 years before he was even born? How can Constantine force the church to recognize something brand new when they already had recognized it well over 100 years before he ever came to reign over the Roman Empire? Also, I'd like to quote Origen, who also was a church father during the 2nd and 3rd century. And this is significant because one of the things the Da Vinci Code asserts is that there were many Gospels floating around out there that were there to choose from. They say over 80 Gospels. Well, that's not true either. There were a few other Gospels circulating out there, but the early church recognized them as being spurious and not authoritative and rejected them. So here's what Origen says. He says, I know a certain Gospel which is called the Gospel according to Thomas, and a Gospel according to Matthias. And many others we have read, lest we should in any way be considered ignorant because of those who imagine they possess some knowledge if they are acquainted with these. Nevertheless, among all these we have approved solely what the church has recognized, which is that only the 4 Gospels should be accepted. What does this indicate? That the early church, before Constantine was even born, had considered several spurious Gospels that claimed to be authoritative and had rejected them because of their content and authorship, and had settled upon Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the bedrock gospel of the Christian faith. By the year 200 A.D., Western Christendom had a sacred body of literature, watch this, that embraced 22 of our 27 books that now are found in the New Testament. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 3rd John were ones that were embraced by various parts of Christendom, but not yet by all of Christendom as being of divine authority. Constantine could not rewrite these. Athanasius, who lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries, in 367 A.D., gave us the earliest listing of all 27 books that are now contained in your New Testament. 367 A.D. Now, why would that be significant? Because if what the Da Vinci Code asserts is true, then by 325 and the Council of Nicaea, we should have had a complete list of all 27 books of the New Testament if the Council of Nicaea decided what books are going to be in your New Testament and rewrote them. But that is not when we get the completed list. It is not for another 30 years that we find the complete list, which means that the church came to agreement on what was of divine authority and should be included in the New Testament, not the Council of Nicaea, and certainly not Constantine. So by the time Constantine came upon the scene and was ruler over the Roman Empire, 75 to 80% of the New Testament was already an established body of sacred literature. The 4 Gospels and most of our New Testament were well in circulation throughout Christendom, and there were literally thousands and thousands of copies of these treasured, beloved, and authoritative writings. Why am I stressing this? Because Dan Brown says Constantine rewrote the New Testament in 325. Now, what you've just learned is all of the New Testament was in circulation by 325, and 22 of the 27 books were already recognized as being of divine authority, right? Let's say that the president of Princeton University calls out by invitation only 100 of the finest scholars of English literature from around the world. And they all meet, and the president of Princeton University announces, here's why I've called you to this place at this time. I want us to rewrite Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. So these scholars set about rewriting this novel. And then when they get through with their convention, they call a conference and they say, we have found the original, the real Gone with the Wind written by Margaret Mitchell. Do you think they'd be laughed off the platform as quacks and as a hoax? Why? Because for 60 plus years, the novel has been published and has been circulating throughout not only America, but the world. I wonder how many copies there are of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind in this congregation. All somebody's got to do is hold up their copy of Gone with the Wind that's been published and say, yours is different from this one. I've got the original. Yours is a hoax. In order for Constantine to have written the entire New Testament, he would not only have had to get the entire church to join with him in the conspiracy, but he also would have to have destroyed the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of copies of the books of the New Testament that were already in existence and circulating throughout the Roman world. Number one, he could never have gotten the entire church to join in the conspiracy because there were Christians various places around the Roman world who had given their lives rather than compromise on the sacred Scriptures that they loved and held close to their breasts. Why would these who had given their lives to embrace and uphold the truth of the Gospels and the letters of the Apostles, why would they compromise? They would have given their lives rather than compromise the sacred Scriptures. So it would be impossible to get the church to join in the conspiracy. And secondly, you cannot regather feathers thrown in the wind, and you would be just as likely to gather up and burn all of the copies of the New Testament that had been circulating throughout the Roman Empire. Folks, it is just absolutely, literally incredible that anybody would believe a fool's tale that Constantine could rewrite the entire New Testament. How reliable is the New Testament that you and I have in our hands? Because you see, they're calling into very question the integrity of the New Testament documents. Well, nobody questions that we have an accurate rendition of Homer's The Iliad that is studied in universities around the world today. Nobody questions that. And do you know there are only 643 ancient copies of Homer's The Iliad? Do you know nobody questions that we have an accurate copy of the Gallic Wars by Caesar? But do you know that there are only 10 copies that have survived? And all of our knowledge of his writings are from those 10 copies? And yet nobody questions that we have an accurate rendition of what he wrote? But when it comes to the New Testament, somebody wants to question whether or not we have a reliable New Testament. Do you know that we have almost 25,000 copies of New Testament documents in various languages and from various locations around the Roman world that are at the disposal of scientists and scholars? And do you know that the science of textual criticism, where they put out all 24,970 copies and they compare them scientifically and they categorize them according to families, that they have developed a New Testament that is more than 99% accurate and reflective of what must have come from the hands of the apostles. That's why I said to the attorney, if you understood church history and the science of textual criticism, you would not be disturbed by these fallacious claims. Third critical factoid of the Da Vinci Code is this: Jesus' deity was not decided upon until 325 at the Council of Nicaea. The Da Vinci Code makes this statement, and I quote, Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea by a relatively close vote. So what he's saying is that the early church did not believe Jesus was divine. And it was only because Constantine needed a divine Savior for around whom he could rally Christians that he pressed upon the Council of Nicaea to vote on Jesus as being divine. Well, that just doesn't square with history either. Constantine did call 300 bishops to Nicaea in 325 AD. That is true. And he did call them together because he was deeply concerned as a Christian leader that his empire was disjointed. And he wanted to unite Christians under his political authority. That is true. But you see, the issue was not which books ought to be in our New Testament. That issue was not even addressed in the Council of Nicaea, and we have very accurate historical documents. So Dan Brown's assertion that it was rewritten in the Council of Nicaea, that's nowhere does that show up in any of the historical documents relating to the Council of Nicaea. They did not debate and argue the deity of Jesus either. What they did do is they debated the definition of Jesus' deity. Specifically, was Jesus co-eternal with the Father? That was the issue, not His deity. And Dan Brown says, by a very narrow vote, His deity was established. The vote that Jesus was coexistent with the Father, by some historical accounts, was 218 to 2. Does that sound like a close vote to you? Some historians say, no, it wasn't 218 to 2, it was 300 to 2. So whether it was a 98% majority or 99% majority, I don't see those as being very close. So once again, was Dan Brown true, or is this factoid? It's factoid. He blew it. The Council of Nicaea came out with this statement: Christ being light of light, very God of very God, begotten not made, being of one substance with the Father. Now that is a high and exalted understanding of the deity of Christ that passed by a 98 or a 99% margin. I'd call that a landslide. Jesus' deity was embraced by the early church, not by Constantinian edict. Constantine could not create something that the early church had embraced from the very beginnings. And then finally, according to the Da Vinci Code, Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. According to the Da Vinci Code, it states, it is a matter of historical record, and Da Vinci was certainly aware of that fact. The Last Supper practically shouts at the viewer that Jesus and Magdalene were a pair. And he goes on to talk about them being married and having children. Folks, there is absolutely no evidence in the Bible. There is no evidence in church history. And there's no credible evidence in church traditions. And there's no credible evidence in the apocryphal literature of the ancient days, that's non-canonical literature, that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. None. According to Paul Meyer, historian at the Western Michigan University, he makes this statement: in fact, in sober fact, Jesus never wed anyone. But for years, sensationalization by novelistic popularizers have played the role of doting mothers trying to marry off an eligible son. Now, if there were even one spark of evidence from antiquity that Jesus even may have gotten married, then as an historian, I would have to weigh that evidence against the total absence of such information in either Scripture or the early church traditions. But there is no such spark. Not a scintilla of evidence anywhere in historical sources. Even where one might expect to find such claims in the bizarre 2nd century apocryphal Gospels, which the Jesus Seminar and other radical voices are trying so desperately to rehabilitate, there is no reference that Jesus ever got married. I would suggest that Brown's novel has many historical errors that are laughable and absurd. I believe that Dan Brown's novel is just that, a well-spun, incredible tale of conspiracy. If you can show, and I think we have, that the foremost cardinal facts or factoids of the novel are false, then you have grounds upon which to question every other assertion that Dan Brown makes in this novel. Josh McDowell has written a book. It's called A Quest for Answers, the Da Vinci Code. This is written as a novel. It's very interesting, easy reading. Josh McDowell has done a superb job, and I suggest you get one, not only so that you can read it and answer the questions that the movie are going to inevitably raise, but you might eventually want to loan these out to others. Now, I want to conclude. Would you agree that the The wealthiest man in all the world is Bill Gates, and Bill Gates can afford anything he wants. Do you know that Bill Gates actually has purchased one of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks? He went to the finest and best authority in the world on Leonardo da Vinci, a Dr. Martin Kemp, who is currently professor of the history of art at the University of Oxford in England. Dr. Kemp gave Bill Gates an extensive history lesson on Leonardo da Vinci and how people love to connect him with all kinds of conspiracies. And none of those linkages have been proven true. And this is an expert speaking here. He concludes with this statement. He says, the problem with Brown's Da Vinci Code is not in its invention of, and he puts this in quotation marks, truth, but that it has been taken seriously by those who cannot recognize fiction as fiction. Don't be suckered in. Don't be disturbed. Get the facts.